Mitch McConnell declaring victory tonight as Twitter reverses its decision to lock his campaign's account because it posted this shocking video of protesters calling for McConnell's death.
He's in there nursing his little broken arm. He should have broke his little raggedy, wrinkled ass neck. Just stab the motherfucker in the heart, please. No, that he'll get a pension. Die!
Good evening to you. I'm John Scott, in for Martha McCallum, and this is The Story. The three-day saga over the threatening video, which is once again viewable on McConnell's campaign account, ended after the Trump campaign, the Republican National Committee, and top conservative groups vowed to stop any spending on Twitter advertising if the social media giant didn't, quote, address this disgusting bias. Here's President Trump today.
We have now, in a little while, all of the heads of the biggest companies coming in, and we're going to talk to them. They treat conservatives, Republicans, totally different than they treat others, and they can't do that.
That meeting with tech leaders the president spoke of was also focused on the rise of online extremism and what can be done to thwart future massacres like those in El Paso and Dayton. Michael Beckerman of the Internet Association was in that meeting. He will join us in moments to tackle both of these issues. But first, Charlie Kirk, founder and executive director of Turning Point USA. The president says conservative voices are being stifled online. Charlie, you've said essentially the same thing.
That's exactly what's happening. An independent study by Quillette showed that out of 22 people that were politically active on Twitter, 21 of them had voiced support of President Trump, and the one person that didn't got suspended temporarily from Twitter for posting a personal cell phone number. And look, anyone who engages on social media can see both the very apparent bias, like what we saw with Mitch McConnell's Twitter account, and I'm glad that there was a hard line drawn and that Twitter essentially righted a wrong. But there's also the subtle bias, the people that don't have the ability to go to the big airwaves and draw attention to this. And you could see in both the language of some of these videos that have come out, of some of the tech executives apologizing for the results of the 2016 election, which we saw with Google. And look, these tech companies have an enormous amount of power, but they also have an enormous responsibility because people look at them as neutral platforms, and they have to start acting like it.
Well, let's talk about the McConnell situation for just a moment. The Senate Majority Leader is home recuperating after breaking his shoulder. His house gets surrounded by protesters, and when his campaign account sends out some video on Twitter of what some of these people were saying, his campaign account gets suspended. How do they justify that?
And they didn't justify it. Now, it's important to remember that the McConnell team, they appealed the decision, and then Twitter doubled down. And then finally today, Twitter backed off because of such an enormous amount of backlash from the Trump campaign and the Republican Party. But mind you, it wasn't Mitch McConnell's volunteers or staffers that were the ones saying these vile things. They were simply cataloging it and publicizing it. And it's important to note that for a specific period of time, almost 12 hours, Mitch McConnell, Senate Majority Leader, didn't have a Twitter account, but Hamas did and Antifa did. Antifa, the very same organization that does these sort of tactics, that goes outside of people's private residences, says vile things, and sometimes goes as far to assault journalists in the streets. I don't understand how Twitter and these tech companies can continue to do these things, use very sort of loose explanations, and then be okay with it. But I think there's a lesson here that if you attack the pocketbook and you threaten that, some very real change can occur.
Right, because the RNC and the Trump campaign said we're not going to buy any more Twitter advertising until you relent. You think that's why Twitter backed down here?
I would have to, well, I think it might be two-pronged. I think that plays a part, a piece of it, because imagine if not just the Trump campaign and the Republican Party, but imagine all Republicans did it. Look, I mean, if they actually want the most amount of business, why would they want to disenfranchise 40 to 45, if at most 50% of the country? It's not good for business. But secondly, this is an indefensible position that they were taking. That Senate Majority Leader's political team that was simply cataloging the hostility and the radicalism towards himself, he's the one that should get penalized for that. It's inexcusable, but this is a pattern of behavior. It's a pattern of behavior from these tech companies, and their excuses are flimsy at best. And this is a major issue heading into 2020. I applaud the president for tackling it head on.
Real quickly, you have said that conservatives tend to acknowledge this bias, point it out, and then kind of throw up their hands and say, that's the way of the internet these days. What do you think they should do beyond that?
Well, it's a difficult question because as conservatives, we're inherently more appreciative of the free market, and we don't want to use regulatory power. We don't want to put more bureaucrats towards any sort of problem. But this is a difficult conversation that's happening right now on the right, and you see it in a robust conversation, which is what is the proper role of government when you have 3 or 4 companies that control basically all the lines of communication online? Are they monopolies? Should they be treated as monopolies? Should they be platforms or publishers? And I think, though, the lesson here is that we as conservatives should not just throw up our hands and say there's nothing we can do. There is something we can do. I think the Republican Party and the Trump campaign did the right thing through trying to challenge the pocketbook. And I think a conversation needs to happen about what is the correct role of government and potential litigation against these tech companies.
Turning Point founder Charlie Kirk.